Hey there, welcome to Beauty at Work. In July 2022, we held an interdisciplinary panel at the University of Oxford on the role of beauty in science. The event was sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and Magdalen College. The panel represented perspectives from diverse disciplines: mathematics, physics, biology, philosophy of science, and sociology. This is the third episode in the series. In this episode, I present results from the world's first large-scale survey of beauty in science. To see the slides from the presentation, please see the show notes for the link to the YouTube video. Following this presentation, we'll have a discussion among panelists and then Q&A from the audience. So we've talked about the role of physics, the role of truth and beauty in physics and biology, and the role of beauty in scientific theories and scientific experiments in biology as well as in physics, and then especially how in theoretical physics and fundamental physics, beauty could lead us astray. I've been reading some of this literature for the last few years and have been really trying to think about, well, there's an empirical question here, which is to what extent do scientists actually subscribe to some of these beliefs? To what extent do they share the perspectives of a Feynman or a Gell-Mann, or to what extent do they find the kind of delight in the kind of recognition, for instance, that Rob was talking about? And so I set out to try to address this question through a research project where we really wanted to get at, by the way, here some more beautiful images from the James Webb telescope. Those of you who might recognize, they just came out. I tried to get at, well, what does beauty mean to not Nobel Prize winners, but to ordinary scientists? What does it mean to people? Where do they experience beauty? Is it really in the eye of the beholder? Is it idiosyncratic, or are there patterns shared in disciplinary communities? How do scientists experience beauty as well as awe and wonder in their scientific work? And how do these experiences shape the practice of science, if at all? And what are the implications of these kinds of aesthetic experiences for things beyond theory choice? So do they affect well-being, motivation, recruitment, retention, and so on in science? So those are some of the kinds of questions I set out to answer. This large project that we call Work and Well-Being in Science. It's a weird title, but the reason for the title, even though the focus of the study was principally on trying to understand the role of aesthetics in science, we didn't want to put aesthetics in the label of the study because we didn't want it to be biased towards only those who cared about aesthetics. So we included aesthetics as one of many things that we were studying. The study was carried out last year in 2021. It's a big survey in 4 countries: the US, UK, Italy, and India. There are a number of reasons why we chose these countries. Principally pragmatic. We had already been doing some research for a number of years, and we had research teams there. They were diverse enough in terms of the R&D, or dedicated towards science, the research infrastructure, cultures, and so on. I can go into more details for those of you who like later on. And just to give you a sense of what we try to do, by scientists here, we just mean physicists and biologists. Sorry for chemists and others in the room. We just had to keep the study manageable, and we just chose 2 disciplines, 2 core disciplines that, as Ben told us at the beginning, have pretty interesting differences aesthetically that we thought would be worth exploring. And the sample to which, or the population to which we want to generalize, is scientists working in PhD granting institutions and research institutes in physics and biology departments. So we got an entire list of all of these scientists, and then we sent out survey invitations to them. Nobody likes taking surveys, so we got 3,500 responses from about 22,000 scientists that we tried to invite. A number of universities essentially blocked our study, so they did not believe that we're not spammers. And so it was really challenging to do this study, but we got a 15% response rate, and then we've weighted our results to that population, which you'll see in what follows. And after doing these surveys, we also interviewed scientists. We interviewed 215 scientists in depth for about an hour to hour and 15 minutes to gain their thoughts on this matter. I won't spend too much time on the demographics, but just to give you an idea, so this is the distribution. We have 16% from the US, 27% from the UK, 39% from India, 19% from Italy, 40% female, 52% physicists, and then the distribution by position somewhat reflects the distribution in the population, right? So nearly 40-something% are graduate students. And so the analysis that I present to you are weighted back to the population. So the first thing I want to look at is, okay, so what do scientists mean by beauty? And to ask this question, we actually spent a couple of years doing pilot work where we went and interviewed a number of scientists in these countries.
and just ask them, what do you mean by beauty? And so, we had some of the literature, the work that Sabina had done and that James has done and so on. We also wanted to hear from scientists when, have you encountered anything that you would consider beautiful, or what is the word beauty? What do you associate the word beauty with in your work? And they would give us various answers, and we tried to collate them. And essentially, we found three different types of beauty in their responses. And the first is what I would call sensory beauty. And so this is the kind of beauty of phenomena, the beauty of cells and stars, and the beauty of things they observe under the microscope, the beauty of even equations, things they find pleasing or pretty. The second kind of beauty is useful beauty. That's the kind of thing that Sabina was talking about and James was talking about, which is the use of beauty, particularly in theory, as a heuristic, as a guide to truth, right? But even in experimentation, we find scientists use beauty as a guide, in the sense of designing an elegant experiment, or certain kind of aesthetic principles are baked into the design of a good experiment. And finally, the third kind is the beauty of understanding. And this resonates a little bit with what Rob was saying. When things come together, you recognize, that's how this mechanism works, right? So those three categories emerged from a broader set of categories that we found. And so these are the kinds of things scientists would tell us that beauty means: the inner logic of systems, the hidden order or patterns that they observe, elegance, simplicity, complexity, symmetry, sense of fit, harmony, pleasing colors or shapes, and finally, asymmetry. Very few, but still many. Those who did talk about asymmetry insisted this is really important. It's neglected. But you see that the main category here has to do with this third type of beauty that I was talking about, the beauty of understanding or insight. And then there are things like elegance and simplicity. And these things vary predictably by discipline. Just as Ben had talked about, physicists care mainly about symmetry. And you can see that first bar there is physics, right? So some 60-something% of physicists find beauty in symmetry and simplicity, and biologists who find more beauty in complexity. So those are the kinds of disciplinary differences that are really striking. Biologists also tend to find more beauty in pleasing colors or shapes compared to physicists. But both physicists and biologists equally find beauty in this third type of beauty, the hidden order or the inner logic of systems. So the beauty of insight, of recognizing what's going on behind things, seems to be especially important and pervasive. The second question is, where in their work do scientists encounter beauty? So these are the things that they find beautiful, but where do these things emerge? Principally, it's in the phenomena that they study. So 75% of scientists say they encounter beauty, however they define it, in cells and particles and so on, 61% in theories, 4% in teaching, 52% in the process of research, and the rest of it is less prominent. Almost all of these categories were equally likely to be expressed by physicists and biologists, except for two of them, which is, not surprisingly, scientific theories. More physicists find beauty in scientific theories than biologists do. So that's like 73% of physicists and 49% of biologists find beauty in scientific theories. And then the writings of prominent scientists, that's the only other area where 40% of physicists compared to 31% of biologists found those beauty in those areas. What we don't really see very much of is beauty in scientific workplaces. For instance, many complain to us about working in horrible labs in basements without windows and so on. And that raises some interesting questions about well-being that they brought up themselves. I'll give you a couple of examples from our interviews about the kinds of beauty they experienced. One told us, if you look under the microscope, there are experiments that are more exciting because there's a visual aspect to it. And it's exciting to see a cell responding under the microscope compared to having just a graph. Even though the graph, the quantification is equally, if not more important, it's not as satisfying. So seeing structures unfold under the cell, that's beautiful, right? Or putting together these amazing, now this is again beauty in the equipment, right? So not even just observation, but in their equipment. These detectors, and that's, this is one scientist talking about the devices that they put together as being beautiful. And so there's numerous arenas in which scientists encounter beauty, from their theories to their data to nature to the actual objects that they're using. And how frequently do such experiences occur? So we'll ask them a lot of questions about, ranging from never to, a few times a year to monthly, weekly, daily. So we give them those sorts of options, ask them a number of questions. And we see that certain kinds of aesthetic experiences are pretty frequent. So at least a few times a year, 86% of scientists said that they felt pleased by the elegance of a scientific object. 86% also were thrilled by a new insight. At least a few times a year, 83% felt their research opened up new mysteries. There's a Feynman quotation here. He talks about an argument with an artist friend of his who complained to him that you physicists, you just reduce things. You don't understand the beauty of a flower. Feynman would say, I know the deeper structures of a flower, and therefore I have greater aesthetic experience. And so the science knowledge doesn't reduce, but it only enhances the sense of mystery. And so this is the sense that most scientists see several times a year, the sense of mystery opening up. 81% felt a sense of childlike delight or joy, as Rob was talking about during their work. 68% felt pleased by encountering symmetry in scientific equations, models, or data. So not just physicists, even biologists find some delight in symmetry. And 66% were pleased by the surprising discovery of a hidden order or deeper systems. Right? So these things occur somewhat frequently in scientific life. And so you have these aesthetic experiences. When are they relevant? When are they important in science? There are a number of interesting differences between physicists and biologists here. Where they share commonalities are when they present or communicate scientific results and when they analyze or interpret scientific results, right? So communication, interpretation, aesthetic criteria matter equally to physicists and biologists. Where you have some differences are biologists seem to find beauty more relevant in the design of a project, in making observations in the lab or in the field, in developing a project plan or grant applications, whereas physicists tend to find beauty more commonly in writing code and in doing theoretical calculations, right? So there are some differences and some similarities again. I'll give you a couple of examples. As one biologist told us, I try to make our experimental design as elegant and as direct as possible, which for me is a form of beauty because the less effort we put into getting an answer, the better. Faster, the cleaner, the fewer different parameters, the more convincing and clean the information will be, right? So you intentionally don't want to design a messy and ugly experiment, is what we learned. Beauty is also socialized and communicated in scientific disciplinary communities in a number of ways. So a number of scientists said that they pay attention to aesthetic aspects of their colleagues' work. 55% say they care about aesthetics at things like conferences or discuss what they find beautiful in science with their colleagues and students. Fewer scientists said that they've changed their minds about what counts as beauty during their career or that they heard their supervisors refer to aesthetic aspects of science. One of the things you got to take with a grain of salt is this is all self-report. I don't know how self-aware these scientists are of how often they're, being aesthetic factors are being communicated to them by their colleagues and so on. And so the question of cognitive bias it's not something that self-reported data is very good at actually getting at, right? We don't really know how much cognitive bias there is in science, and people are rarely capable of recognizing it in themselves. Okay, so what? So what are the consequences then of encountering beauty in science? Well, we talked about motivation. 62% of scientists say that encountering beauty motivated them to share the beauty of science. Similar percentage said that it motivated them to pursue a scientific career. 57% say that encountering beauty improves their scientific understanding. So it's an asset to understanding. 50% say it helped them persevere when they experience difficulties or failure, motivates them to communicate science to their public. Places where you find some differences disciplinarily are more physicists are likely to say that encountering beauty gives them confidence in their results compared to biologists. And similarly, more physicists are likely to say that encountering beauty makes them think that they're on the right road to reach truth in their investigation. Right? So there seems to be a greater sense among physicists that beauty is a reliable guide to truth. Again, in terms of consequences, one of the researchers we talked to told us, I don't think you really enter academia unless you've had that sense of encountering beauty. It's a bit of a rat race. The whole time you have to be struck by the beauty of all of it, either the process or just the universe or whatever. Otherwise, you wouldn't do this. Why would you do all this? And this is one of the things that actually motivated my own study is in a previous research project, we heard scientists telling us that what made their work worthwhile was we don't get paid very much. There's a lot of political bullshit to put up with. We do it because it's beautiful. And I wanted to know, well, how pervasive is that sentiment? And this is an attempt to try to understand that. Okay, so how do scientists then evaluate the role of beauty in science? And for this one, we pulled out the theoretical physicists just to get a sense of whether they were any different. And so we have theoretical physics, other physics, and then biology. And here we see there's no difference in answering the question of science helps us better access the beauty that actually exists in the world. This is a kind of claim that Frank Wilczek seems to be making. It is important for scientists to encounter beauty, awe, and wonder in their research. So you've got somewhat around 70% or so of scientists seem to believe those things, that beauty is really important and it helps us access beauty in the world. Now, when it comes to things like a good theory or experiment needs to be elegant, Gell-Mann. Theoretical physicists are a bit more likely. Now, our sample of theoretical physicists is small, so that error bar doesn't allow us to be confident in some of those distinctions. But certainly when it comes to the idea that a beautiful or elegant theory is more likely to be correct than a theory that is inelegant, that's Gell-Mann again. Definitely physicists, theoretical or not, believe that much more than biologists do. The idea that mathematical beauty is a good indicator of scientific truth, again, physicists are more likely than biologists to believe that. The pursuit of aesthetic considerations like symmetry and elegance is bad for scientific progress. There's equally only about 10% across disciplines seem to think that it's a bad thing, even though they seem to be suspicious of it, right? So they're not entirely sure that beauty is reliable, but they don't think it's bad either. These are questions we asked only of physicists because in our pilot study, when we tried to ask them of biologists, they laughed at us and said that those questions are silly. So these questions that society should invest more resources to pursue unified theory of physics. Of course, biologists wouldn't really seem to care about that. But there's a bit of difference between theoretical physicists and others. Here's the huge difference. In scientific models and theories, I consider numbers that are much larger or smaller than 1 to be ugly. I think that's the naturalness factor that Sabina talked about. So very clearly, theoretical physicists care about that much more than other physicists. Not much difference in their opposition to Dirac's claim that it is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. So only about 10% or so of physicists agreed with that claim, and about something like 80% disagreed with Dirac on that point. So I'm going to stop there. There are a few other considerations, and I'm happy to talk about them later. For instance, we find an important link between aesthetics and well-being in science, and differences across positions. So graduate students are much more likely to experience aesthetic experiences in science, or at least they experience aesthetic experiences in beauty more frequently than scientists across their career stages. And there's an interesting sort of little bit of a U-shaped curve that across the scientific career, the beauty gets beaten out of you by the institutional factors that are in science. But I'll stop there for now, and I think what we'll do is have the panelists come up and chat about what we just talked about, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you all. Maybe we could put Milena up on the screen so she can join us as well, and we could probably all, if all the panelists might come up here, and then we can see if you all have any questions for each other. I'm curious to know if any of these data have raised new questions or new ideas for you all, or if you have ideas that you want to riff off each other as questions or comments. It's a bit unusual with Milena up there, but that's fine. We can see you, so that works.
So I, for one, it's up, of course, to our chair, but I would be very interested in hearing comments from the audience.
Absolutely, we're gonna open it up in just a second, but I just wanted to know if people had any questions for each other on your presentations and any reflections.
All I'd say is I just commented as I did in my talk that I thought was a very happy confluence of ideas among all of us. Actually, I would say I think this emphasis on the human and the personal perspective, I think, and the experiential and the way in which things are just found to work, and that is found to link to aesthetic experience or response, does seem to be something that's a common thread, and that's a nice thing to find. But I think it's very good to be warned about the fact that it's the successful people who speak and it's the Nobel Prize winners who have their quotes banded around, and elegance isn't always tied to the truth. But that's just one comment.
Yeah. I was wondering, James, I mean, when you were talking about the success of theories, Sabina's made this point too, that there's also the the socialization process in science where you are in an institutional environment. So perhaps I wonder if, it's not just the success or track record of a particular theory, but also the sort of social dynamics of people wanting to go where the money is, wanting to go where there's funding, and then people with funding want to protect themselves and not have any threats to that particular line of inquiry. So people have complained that string theory has been for perhaps too long, too well funded, and critiques were, perhaps not as, not as difficult it was not as easy to challenge some of those sorts of ideas. So I wonder what you think the role of not just rationality, but also some of those other factors like institutional resources and imitation and wanting to be like the successful people and not just imitate successful ideas might play. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yes. Well, I would say make 2 points. The first is that this inductive process is very largely socially implemented. It's not an induction that one conducts in the privacy of one's study. It's something that is mediated by the academic community, the particular scientific community, and it's also carried out and transmitted largely in the form of training. So it's a large part of your training that you are socialized to find certain theories and approaches aesthetically attractive. So that's certainly one heading in which the social process is important. You, of course, mentioned some more complex processes, follow the money, invitations, and so on. I would respond to that if the scientific, the branch of science in question is well organized and truth apt, then that sort of thing does, or at least should, attract empirical success too. So it may well be, as a sociologist, you may well tell me, no, prizes are awarded on a quite different basis, invitations are awarded on a quite different basis, and so on. But if it's run in as a truth-apt enterprise, then we're giving our top prizes to the people whose theories, in a sense, that's not the only reason, but if they're theoreticians whose theories have a certain track record of empirical success. And so it all comes right in the end.
Maybe I can add something. I think part of the drive towards beauty, especially in the very theoretical parts of physics, is kind of baked into the way that we decide whether something is successful. Because most of when you're trying to get something published or you're trying to get something funded, it depends very strongly on how many people like your work. And physicists like beautiful theory. So if you're working on something that's perceived as beautiful, whether or not it's empirically adequate, it makes it more likely that other people also want to work on it. And that makes your life much, much easier. And I think that's certainly one of the reasons why ideas like string theory and supersymmetry have carried on so much, because people just like to work on it because it's beautiful.
If you want to just introduce yourself, just tell us your name, where you're from.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kavir. I'm a philosophy student here in Oxford. So, just a quick question, I think directly related to one of the surveys that you showed, and this is to everyone in the panel and what their thoughts are. I think what I was interested in, there's a very nice asymmetry between beauty and good science. So I think you showed that, around like 80% of biologists and physicists believe that science helps us appreciate beauty, or there's an implication from good science to beauty. But the other way around, from beauty to science, that's like around 10%. So there's a very stark asymmetry. So what's going on there in some sense? Because you would think that, if around like 80%, 85% of scientists think that good science, or at least good science, gives you some grasp of beauty, then the reverse implication that something which is not beautiful is not maybe good science, that also holds, even if the other direction doesn't hold. So what's going on there in some sense?
So, I think, so essentially the two ideas there was, one was that there's objective beauty in the world, and science can help us better understand that. And so, I think the quote from Wilczek is that the natural world embodies beautiful ideas. And so, I think a number of scientists have basically said that science gives us access to, it helps us to better understand the things that we find beautiful, right? So that's because it gives us more knowledge into things. Whereas the other idea was that beauty matters much more than experimentation. I think that, so that the one that had just the 10% agreement. So it's enough for your equations to be beautiful. And my thought with Dirac, I mean, Dirac's a strange man, but I thought that, he was essentially very confident that the mathematics will eventually be proven experimentally. I'm not quite sure why. So I think, I mean, maybe Sabina, you might have a better idea, or others might, as to what gives them confidence that even if experimental data today don't seem to corroborate with these beautiful equations, don't worry, just be patient, give it another 50 or 100 years and a few more $1 billion, and then you'll eventually see that I'm right. And it's happened at times. There were times that physicists, I think, stuck to their guns, even though experimental data initially did not support them. And then eventually the experiments proved to have been mistaken. They're like, see, we told you our beautiful equations held out. I think you might have a better explanation for why there's that confidence in beauty, even if experimental data may initially not support it. But that's only held by a very small minority of physicists, and I don't know why they would hold to that.
So I'm not entirely sure I correctly understood the question. Let me just try to say it in my own words. Is the question like, if you ask scientists, does a good theory have to be beautiful? They'd say like, yeah, well, maybe I'm not perfectly convinced. But if you ask them, would you accept an ugly theory? They would say like, no. Basically, this discrepancy between the answers.
I saw that there was an asymmetry between scientists saying that science helps us appreciate beauty, or makes us appreciate beauty in some sense. That was the first. But there was another kind of survey statistic that you showed, which said that whether beauty helps us track truth or track whatever the enterprise of science is. And that was also quite low throughout biologists and physicists. So there is this asymmetry, right? Because many people, the vast majority, think that science can lead to appreciation of beauty, but really not many people think that beauty can lead to whatever the aim of science we take it to be, whether truth or empirical adequacy or so on and so forth. So there's this asymmetry, and it seems, well, I don't know if it seems surprising or not.
Well, so they would say to me that beauty can help with scientific understanding. So beauty, they do say there's quite a few, like more than like nearly 60% say that beauty helps with scientific understanding. Where they would disagree is that beauty is a reliable guide to truth, and they would say that it's in many ways, I think, echoing your cautions. Maybe they've all read your book, because I was surprised to find that some of those statistics were so low. They seem very reticent, even in their interviews. They would say, yeah, beauty could be a guide. And, even at Ben, as you say at the end, it's not, beauty can mislead us. And scientists seem aware of that by and large, that just relying on beauty isn't going to do it. And
Can I just ask something, kind of join in as well? I'm not sure whether I should just jump in and interrupt.
Please, yes.
It's awkward. But yes, thank you very much for the question. And I was just thinking about the fact that you don't have to have a true theory to appreciate nature, right? We've appreciated nature for a lot of past false theories. And if you think about experiments, like you can appreciate a kind of an experiment where you're doing something with combustion and think, my goodness, this is looking amazing and it's helping me engage in the beauty of nature. If you're thinking this is about phlogiston being released, you have a very false theory and you're still engaging very much aesthetically with what's going on in nature. And so I think there are two very different things, right? The fact that, yes, systematically approaching a phenomenon that is natural through science is one thing. Of course, we're going to find more people thinking that this is where, the beauty is, engaging with nature in this way, than actually saying the much more substantial epistemologically claim that beauty then in our theory guarantees or gives higher likelihood for us to be correct in the kind of answers we're giving. Right? So I think it's different ways in which we're applying the concept. And in one, it's just engagement and perhaps trying to gain understanding, and the other is much more substantial. It's unsurprising, I think, that there's a lot more caution with the second kind of question. Thank you.
I just think it's also worth reflecting that it's possible that the experience of beauty isn't so much a driver as a symptom of something else. which is that it's actually a symptom of the deep engagement of the scientist with whatever it is they're studying. And so personally, that's really kind of where I find myself, actually, that it's more of a symptomatic thing. We experience beauty because we put our heart into it. And when you put your heart into something, you throw yourself at it, that's how you get a full understanding of it. And that means that you learn to love it, or you learn to find it beautiful. And this relates also to what Ben was saying and others, that actually I think there is something, of course there's something adaptive about what we find beautiful, and it's to do with our experience. And it's a symptom, that experience of beauty is a symptom of what we're doing, which is throwing ourselves at it and opening ourselves to it. So I just think that's relevant to the question. I think people are kind of perhaps being a little bit self-critical and thinking, well, I shouldn't use beauty as a guide to the truth. But actually, I suspect they very often do find, as it happens perhaps by chance, that the things turn out to be true. They do think are beautiful, but I think it's because they've put their all into it to find out what they needed to find.
I think that it's interesting that you mentioned, like Dirac, for example. You would think that that very, very highly refined mathematical sensibility, very, very logical, if you like, also comes coupled to this very intuitive feeling, this non-rational part, which is much more emotional, if you like. And in some people, those two things are sort of very, very closely intertwined, that there's such a deep feeling that this has to concord with the truth. I think partly because it's the engagement with the mathematics generates a kind of love for the mathematics. And I mean, I think that there is, I wouldn't really know how to approach the problem, but there has to be a really deep biological basis for this. And I think it might not even be purely a human response. Like Jane Goodall, the primatologist, talks about watching chimpanzees as they investigate a waterfall and conjecturing that they're experiencing a sense of awe. When they see this thing, which is a marvel of nature, they adapt their behavior and they start to engage with it and they start to explore it. And so she conjectures, well, they are experiencing something like what we would describe as awe. Now, it has a purpose, though. It means that they engage with that thing and they explore it and they come to know it. So you could see that there's a kind of benefit to that, like evolutionarily, and also in terms of science, that it really draws you into things. And it's not really a rational response. It's something different to that. And you could easily see how those two things could be beneficial in some circumstances and highly non-beneficial in other circumstances, and very, very hard to disentangle, because the one side of it is much more of an emotional response than the other, but sometimes they get intertwined. And I mean, I don't know about the high energy physics area, but I can kind of see how that could happen very easily with very particular sensibilities, like, Dirac's, for instance. And if they're held up as the sort of ultimates in that particular discipline or that particular area, and there are additional social biases imposed, for instance, like the quote I gave from Feynman, where he says, inexperienced students. Well, if you're a graduate student learning, feeling your way into that community, you're not going to question that. I mean, you'll just sort of pick that up and take it into yourself. And it becomes internalized to such an extent that you can't really even maybe rationalize it to yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that's important factors. We got a lot of questions coming in, hands up as well. So let me ask for, maybe I'll start collecting questions. I know Leticia has her hand up, or Leticia, feel free to write your question in the chat. We have a question from Deepshika. Do you think the commonality of beauty across scientific disciplines might be indicative of a higher intelligence or power? Let me collect a couple. Sir, from you had your hand up there, and then yourself. And we'll collect 3 questions, and then we'll jump to.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Gibbons. I'm a computer scientist. I was wondering about this asymmetry. Gilman and Penrose was saying that a true theory must be beautiful. If it's ugly, then it's not true. But the other side is Dirac's side, which is a beautiful theory must be true. And that's the controversial one, perhaps. That's the one in the sense in which beauty is not a reliable guide for you. Lots of beautiful theories have been slain by ugly facts. So I wonder if that was the asymmetry that's coming out. So beauty is a characteristic of true things, but not all beautiful things are true.
Right. It can also be a characteristic of false theories.
So I will give an illustration to set up the question. It might be a little bit funny of illustration, but it will set up nice. So I always find newborn babies to not be very beautiful. Okay, but a mother will always find the baby to be beautiful, her baby to be beautiful. It might be because she recalibrates her sense of beauty. I don't know. But as the second talk led me to think is that no matter what the final, if there is a final theory of physics be, no matter what the theory is, we will always find it beautiful, no matter what. Is this the case?
Sounds like the conclusion to your book. Feel free to address any of those questions. Anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah. So this is kind of how my book ends. So in the end, I explain I got a new research grant, and I'll work on something, and we will come to find it beautiful. So there's a lot of people were really confused why I said this, but it was exactly this point that I was trying to get across. Like whatever we will find, if it's correct, we will come to find it beautiful. I should also something to what you said earlier before I forget about this. A lot of physicists who I talk to who are not in science communication tend to not think about the stuff as beauty to begin with. There are certain mathematical criteria that they use, like unification, for example, the search for a theory of everything, naturalness, and so on. But they don't necessarily put it down as beauty. This is really something you find in popular science writing and that kind of stuff.
Thanks so much. Very interesting questions. One thing that I would say, I think in answer to both, so one of the contributions that I've tried to make is to relativize the category of beauty with respect to history. I think in general, it's a mistake to think that given all the theories in history of science, there's one subset that are strikingly beautiful and another subset that's perhaps strikingly ugly, and these categories never change. To my mind, what counts as beautiful, what is held as beautiful, is highly plastic historically. And so to some extent, that solves, if you accept this principle, that solves both the problems. It's not the case that we have this enormous coincidence that it's the beautiful theories that turned out to be true and the true theories that are true. There's an underlying mechanism there. As regards your question, I think the question of babies is a little bit different, just as the question of art, fine art, the sort of art on the walls here, that there's also a sense in which that's beautiful, but I think that's also a different case. I've never suggested that I had a theory of everything in terms of all aspects of beauty. So I think I'll put babies in another category. But it is the case, just as Sabina said, I think that a theory of everything that's endorsed wholeheartedly is going to be a very successful theory. And so will reshape the aesthetic canons, whether at first we thought the theory was ugly or not. And so there is this inevitability of it. The better a theory is, given enough time, the more it's going to center or retune our aesthetic sensibilities, especially in that scientific community, in order to make itself beautiful. So this is not a case of the ugly duckling that turns beautiful. It's largely a case of the aesthetic canons that are reshaped under the impact of the empirical performance. That, in any case, that's how I see it.
And just briefly, and relating to the question that was asked on the screen from Deepshika Sharma about whether which Brandon you read out, didn't you? Yes. Mm-hmm. Whether the commonality of experience of beauty indicates the existence of a higher power. I'm pretty certain every one of us will have a different answer on this if we wanted to go around. What I would say is I'm actually an Anglican priest, as well as the things that Brandon said about me at the beginning. So clearly I do have a commitment to a belief in God personally. But what I would say is, I think what I would strongly want to affirm is it emphasizes the importance of the spiritual as a human experience. I think the human experiences are fundamentally spiritual. Love for one another is a spiritual experience. And I think that the fundamental importance of the spiritual, however one understands that within a human life, is indicated by this, I would suggest. What I would also just comment, relating also to this question, is that a comment was made earlier about this, particularly by Zabina, about issues around why should our minds fit these our understanding of the world, and why should the beautiful theories we enjoy fit the way the world is. Now, of course, that does relate to a whole area of argument about the existence of God, where you get very different points of view. Thomas Nagel, an atheist philosopher, thinks that question is very important, that has a non-theistic answer of a kind. And then there's a whole school of people who would try and say, well, the fact our minds fit the way the world is does suggest that we're made in the image of God. That's not what I'm saying, but that is a point of view that is put out there. But as I say, I would say that it underscores the value of the spiritual as a general idea, because human lives are spiritual, basically.
Could I jump in on
please, ma'am.
answering
Yes.
this question as well? So just a slightly different way of answering this last question, and actually going back to something that Ben said about how we experience nature. I think you can give an evolutionary answer as to why we feel very happy when we find beauty in nature, but also very happy when our explanations are really elegant and, we find symmetry. It's because we're processing information in this way. And it's easier to process information when things are very neat. And this perhaps, there's this kind of, call them biases, call them cognitive constraints on our own kind of ways in which we process information from the out world. Is basically reflective of this. So the experiences of beauty that we have and these constraints we put into the kinds of explanations we want, to the kind of experiments we want to run, perhaps are just reflecting of this cognitive capacities that we have, the very specific cognitive capacity. And as Ben said earlier, it pays off to be able to spot stuff in the world, like to be able to spot patterns, because you will avoid predators, you will survive, to when you're spotting symmetries and patterns together. And it pays off to find your baby beautiful because it means they will survive. So another way of thinking about it, not indicating anything to do with higher powers, but just reflecting our own capacities and the human kind of condition of how we process information. And perhaps the aesthetic experiences we have are just either very deeply ingrained in our understanding, or maybe just byproducts of that understanding, of that cognitive success that we achieve. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that the type of aesthetic experience that is shared by most scientists is around insight, right? So it's not the symmetry or the complexity, but it's that ability to grasp the inner workings of the inner logics of things. And so, yeah, I think there are certainly those theological arguments about if we delight in the grasping of logic, then there must be maybe a source of that logic. But I think also, the question is interesting. In our data, we find there's really we actually have a little bit of data on the religiosity of scientists. There's no relationship between the religiosity of scientists and their frequency of experiences of beauty or wonder. There is, however, a relationship between scientists' sense of spirituality, as they call it, and their frequency of experiencing awe. So the more you experience awe, the more important you would consider spirituality in your life as a scientist. But when it comes to beauty, there's really no difference, at least in our data, with any kind of religious variable.
And I'll just add that it's just to follow from Marlena that despite what I said about human beings have a spiritual aspect, which is about meaning in our lives, basically, I also believe it's all evolved, of course, and it's all clearly environmentally factored both during our own lives as we evolve as individuals and are shaped by our experiences, and obviously by the fact that we're evolved animals.
Yeah. Well, I want to recognize that we've reached our time. Certainly we're after 6 here. So please do stick around for refreshments and Q&A with our speakers, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists today. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked that video, please hit that thumbs up button and share it with your friends. Also, please take a second to hit the subscribe button because it really helps us out.